Hi guys, so I guess where we ended in the lesson was around the cyclotrons. So I just want to talk a bit more about the synchrotron. Now, where we kind of left off is that the cyclotron is this first time where we have an accelerator which is in a circular path, and what's good about it is that you can apply the same frequency electric field all the time, and regardless of how fast this particle is moving and which path it's taking, whether it's an inner circle or an external circle, it'll always arrive at the halfway point or the gap between the D's at the same time. And so you can send batches of particles to be accelerated, spaced out, and they will all be accelerated because they all reach this gap at the same time, which is great. But like we said, it's affected by relativistic momentum, because once you get to relativistic speeds, let's just get that out of the way. Once you get to relativistic speeds, your mass to charge ratio may potentially change. Now, moving on to the kind of synchrotron. The synchrotron is almost very similar to the cyclotron, but the main difference is that where in a cyclotron the magnetic field stays constant. And my goodness, this size is huge. Let me just reduce it a bit. So in a cyclotron, the magnetic field stays constant, doesn't change, and what changes is the radius of the path. That's what increases, right? So the magnetic field stays constant, but importantly, the radius of the path increases. Now, in a synchrotron, the idea is exactly the opposite. The magnetic field increases, but the radius is constant, right? So that's how you can kind of frame the two different accelerators in your head. Now, in terms of how they work, essentially you have a primary sort of path, which is shown in the image below. These particles travel through vacuum tubes. The reason why you need a vacuum tube, for obvious reasons, is because you don't want it to collide with air particles just hanging around. And that goes for all the other accelerators as well. Ideally, you want to have nothing else inside except the particles you are trying to collide or accelerate. So evacuated pipes is important. And there are places, particularly near the curvatures, where you're going to get magnets which focus/deflect, and the idea is to keep them in the circular path. So that's these guys here. The blue and the gray are all magnets that help to deflect the particles so that they stay in a particular path. Now, then you have what's called the radio frequency cavities, or RF cavities, and those are places where the actual acceleration happens. So this here and this here, that's where the acceleration occurs, because this is where they get short bursts of electric fields that accelerate them to a higher velocity. And so, as you can imagine, as they increase in speed, they're going to actually return to these radio frequency cavities at a high frequency as well, right? So you can imagine it's kind of like you start off slow and you increase until you get really fast. So you start going between the RF cavities at a much higher frequency. And so as a result, you can imagine not only does the magnetic field also have to increase to adjust for your increase in velocity to maintain the same radius, but also the frequency at which these electric fields have to fire also increases. And it's simply because you are traveling more distance in a shorter amount of time. In other words, your frequency of movement around that circular kind of path is increasing. So frequency of firing increases. That's important. Now, this is just merely trying to show you that the magnetic field is what has to change to maintain a constant radius if your velocity increases. Now, in terms of advantages and disadvantages, the primary disadvantage is that you cannot do the similar this multi-batch system that you have for cyclotrons, right? You have to do one batch at a time, and that one batch has to finish accelerating before you put in the next batch, because you cannot have batches of different speeds moving around in this, because the radio frequency cavities, like I said, is highly dependent on the velocity in which your particles are moving through. So let's say you have a bunch of particles that move through at 50 hertz per second, and your RF cavities are firing at 50 hertz. Then if you have another set of particles that are moving through at 15 hertz or 15 rotations per second, then your RF cavities are not going to be firing in a way that is synchronous to allow them to accelerate at the right times. So obviously, the downside is you need to have a single batch of particles finished, colliding, and accelerated before you can get the new batch. Now, having said that, though, to put it into context, cyclotrons generally tend to be the initial stage of a multi-stage accelerator. So it's not like you're going to find cyclotrons, well, you can find cyclotrons in isolation, but oftentimes you'll find it as the first part of a multi-part accelerator. So the cyclotron kind of gets you up to the right speed, maybe, close to what you need, and then the synchrotron kind of gives it the final push all the way to 1 TeV instead of MeV. So what are the advantages? I think it's pretty obvious. You can get extremely high energy collisions with something like a synchrotron. And that goes back to the kind of concepts that we talked about earlier in the lesson around why we have particle accelerators in the first place. It's to produce these incredibly high energy collisions and to get further into the nucleus to see what the internal structure of particles like protons and neutrons are. So I guess the last thing I want to talk about, now that we've finished talking about the three main types of accelerators that you need to know about, primarily how they function, what are the main components, and also an advantage and disadvantage of them. Once you've figured that out, I guess the next point of importance to figure out is what is so important about these particle accelerators. Now, oftentimes you'll get a question that asks you, what is the significance of particle accelerators and their contribution to our understanding of the Standard Model? Or they might ask, what is the significance of particle accelerators and our understanding of subatomic or fundamental model of matter, or standard model of matter, or the fundamental nature of matter, or something like that, right? Basically, it's a question of significance. And almost always I suggest to students that the best way to answer these sorts of questions is to first explain what a particle accelerator is. You don't need to talk about all these three different types of particle accelerators. This is what this synopsis is for. You explain what particle accelerators are for and briefly explain why we need them and the two different, typical types of applications that particle accelerators have. And then I tend to suggest to students to give a case study. And the reason why is because a case study really puts it into context exactly how this has been used in the past and brings your answer from the abstract into reality. So just to kind of break down this a little bit more, right? We have now tracking devices that register each particle's passage and essentially tracks the momentum and energies of the particles that get released after a collision event, because collisions create lots and lots of subatomic particles. Now, as a result, we can then use these momentum and energy values and back calculate the different types of particles we see within a collision. And sometimes these collisions allow us to observe particles we haven't seen before. And one example is what we call the Higgs boson. And that's something we'll talk about more in the Standard Model of Matter lesson. But essentially, Higgs boson is has always been this kind of particle that we, assumed that it existed and hypothesized it existed, but we never had any experimental evidence to prove that this particle indeed existed. We had some hypotheses for how we would be able to observe it if it did exist, but we never really observed it in nature or observed any evidence for its existence until the presence of what we call a accelerator or particle accelerator. And in this particular case, the case study refers to the Large Hadron Collider, which I'm not sure if you recall, but in 2013, I remember I was quite young at the time, and this came out in newspaper back when newspapers still existed in paper form. But I was reading it in the Sydney Morning Herald of all places, and it spoke about the Large Hadron Collider and the discovery of the Higgs boson. And effectively, what happened is that the Higgs boson is this highly unstable a particle that decays incredibly quickly. And what they observed within this particle accelerator, plus particle detector, of course, because when you have a particle accelerator, that's for the collision, then you need an actual particle detector to see the products. But either way, you have this particle accelerator and particle detector, and what they observed within this particle detector is the decay products of Higgs boson. So these decay products are the hypothesized decay products that you would get if a Higgs boson particle had actually decayed, right? So they observed that decay products of the Higgs boson inside the Large Hadron Collider. And that was something of very big significance because it provided experimental evidence for the fact that the Higgs boson that was hypothesized before did in fact exist. And these particle detectors, purely out of interest for something so that you can actually write about the case study in the Higgs boson, they were called the CMS and the Atlas. And these are particle detectors that were placed within a Large Hadron Collider, which is the particle accelerator, right? So one is the particle accelerator, one is the particle detector. And of course, later on, as most science progresses, we found more and more evidence for the fact that Higgs boson existed later on in the CERN, and this kind of generated confidence that Higgs boson in fact did exist, right? So again, as I said, this last slide is mainly for you to understand how you may potentially be assessed on your understanding of accelerators and their significance in physical discovery. So either you'll be asked particularly about how accelerators work, or you may be examined on specific components within multiple choice on the individual accelerators, or alternatively, you'll be asked about the significance of accelerators and how they've contributed to our understanding of subatomic particles and things like quarks and things like Higgs boson. And so in this particular case, you would write about what I've just told you. So hopefully that gives you a better understanding of the latter half of our lesson, and thank you for tuning in.